Today, I want to take a look at backing up my MacBook onto my Proxmox server using a TrueNAS VM. This method I found to be one of the easiest ways to do a Mac backup and without having to dive into Samba settings and Bonjour and all the Apple special connection utilities, and make it easy so I can back up using the built-in Time Machine utility on my Mac, restore it relatively easy with a demo of that coming at the end of this video, and hopefully be a relatively painless way to have my Mac auto-backed up whenever I'm at home connected to Wi-Fi. Since my Mac goes with me in many places, and laptop thefts or failures happen, I want to be ready to be able to buy a new system and restore my data in case something bad was to happen, so I don't lose any data. While I currently use one of these little portable external hard drives, this means I have to remember to plug it in every once in a while, and it bugs me about me taking too long to remember to do that at times, and I have to remember where I put the drive and more. And I find that as a hassle that sometimes keeps me from doing the backups as frequently as I possibly would like to, and since my laptop sits plugged in at home reasonably often, maybe that's a more seamless way. So I'm going to take a look at how that works. And also I could use iCloud to back up a lot of my personal data, but I find Time Machine does a much better job at backing up all the system utilities, and iCloud storage adds up pretty quickly cost-wise as they pay per month, and I already have an extra couple hundred gigs to a terabyte on my main server, and the drive in this isn't that big in the scheme of my total NAS space. With all that intro and moving away my old external backup drive, let's dive into how I can set up that VM. So I want to talk a little bit about how Samba and all this works. Unlike many other backup software where you can essentially map it to a network address like a Samba share and say, hey, back up to this location, here's the credentials you need to use, macOS forces you to look for a share on the network that it does its auto-find to work and find it. And this, to me, gets a little bit complicated and annoying to set up at times because you have to use Apple's Bonjour system that used to use AFP back in the day. And while it can be set up in the SMB command line, my goal is to do a tutorial and for my personal use the simplest way, which I found to be TrueNAS with a nice, easy web GUI. Let me know in the comments below if you want to find a way to do it in the command line with a Samba share. And a basic TrueNAS VM I found to be relatively lightweight on resources. While TrueNAS recommends using large amounts of RAM and storage, which is really nice, for a basic file server, it really doesn't need that many resources as a VM, so we'll see how that goes on there. So up here is my main interface for my TrueNAS, for my Proxmox system I'm going to install it onto. And I can see what I call A shuck as my main storage where I have 12 terabytes available. Since this Mac has a 500 gigabyte drive I want to back up, something like 1 terabyte of space in my thinking was going to be enough space for all the backups plus changes in the future. And that's going to give me plenty of space. So now let's download and get TrueNAS going. So here's the TrueNAS website. I'm going to say I already have it, and I'm going to download the latest stable version. So that's 25.10.5, and it's downloading TrueNAS Scale, which is currently the only version of TrueNAS because the older core version has been discontinued and everything's using Scale, which is now Linux-based. So now that my TrueNAS ISO is finished uploading, let's go create the VM for backing up my laptop. So I'm going to go under Create VM, going to give it a name like MacBook Backup, and I'm going to leave most things default here, as they're already kind of prepped for a Linux VM, which TrueNAS in most ways is a fairly normal Linux VM. So I'm going to direct it to my TrueNAS file I just uploaded. Under System, I'm going to leave everything default except for QEMU agent, which I believe is enabled by default in TrueNAS. We'll find out soon. And also, shouldn't hurt anything if it's on a VM that doesn't need it. Sometimes I like to enable things like UEFI BIOS, but in the testing for this video, TrueNAS had some issues with having to disable Secure Boot. So Legacy should be supported for a while, especially in Linux-based OSs. Under disks, I'm going to just stick with the default 32 gigabytes because for a TrueNAS install, that should be plenty of space as it's essentially a lightweight Linux distro. I like turning discard on just so I can free up some space by essentially telling the OS that can be trimmed to free space if needed, and VirtIO block should give the best performance and lowest overhead on a supported OS like Debian with no extra configuration. Under CPUs, I like to give it 4 cores on most VMs if I have a system that can support that, just because it can make things like updating, installs, and more a bit more snappy if it needs that little burst of performance. but essentially a basic file server like this won't need anywhere near what 4 cores on any modern host should be able to provide. Under memory, I'm going to give it the full 8192 that TrueNAS recommends. Maybe I'll set minimum memory a little bit lower, which will just balloon it down so it doesn't need the memory on a host if needed. But I'm not going to go under TrueNAS's recommendation for this install, even though you could probably get away with underneath the recommendation because it's essentially a lightweight VM, and I don't need lots of ZFS caching for the best performance. Under network, I'm going to just use the default bridge for the purpose of this video, as well as using the VirtIO networking, and confirm and create my VM now. So now that my VM is created, I'm going to hit start on it, wait for the VM to finish starting, and once it's started, open my console to see what's going on in the interface. And it looks like it's already in grub for the installer. Seems to be starting to boot and do some things, but I see this weird flashing thing, which I might have to do a little bit of troubleshooting to fix. So I'm going to give it a few seconds to see if it starts working, and boom, it looks like it starts working, and I'm going to do part of its initial installation. So it looks like it's starting to copy some files, can't open one of my block devs, and in a second or two, the installer should be ready like it is now. And like TrueNAS has been for the last decade or more, it has a real simple, easy-to-use installer where I can just hit install, hit yes. I'm going to configure all this using the web UI later on, and I'll allow UEFI boot, which should work on here if I did want to change it to UEFI boot later on, but it should also work with legacy boot. We'll see in a second. So TrueNAS generally installs very quickly, so in a minute or two, I'll be ready to go into the web interface for this system. Actually, I'm going to shut down the system because before I can actually use it as a backup, I have to configure one more thing, and that's giving it the actual storage it's going to use to back up my laptop. Because this laptop has a 512 gig SSD, I'm going to give the VM 1 terabyte of storage, so that gives me space for backing up a full disk plus a terabyte, so if I make changes, it can keep changes going back reasonably far. And one of the great things of virtualization is it's super easy if I want to just add a bit more space if I need more backup versions, for example, or upgrade to a laptop with more storage. So I'm going to put a total of 1 terabyte, discard, VirtIO block, add, and that should be ready to go as just additional storage for the VM. So now that my TrueNAS VM is set up, now that my TrueNAS VM is booted for the first time, which takes a little bit of extra time because it has to set up some crypto keys, so it takes a few minutes compared to the typically very fast boot ups of most Linux VMs like TrueNAS, it gives me my IP address if I want to go log into the web UI right now. Once I'm logged into the web interface, I find it's a lot easier to go in here, say edit. I can say define a static IP address, add a new one. And one thing I'd like to do is use the VM ID in Proxmox as part of the IP address. So in this case, it's 118. So I might use an IP address like 192.168.1.118. And in some different setups where I, for example, have a /16 network, I might need 1 octet to mean this Proxmox server or Proxmox cluster it's on, and then the node. And since oftentimes I have essentially a /8 worth of local IP addresses I can use for various needs, I find it often easier to use octets to define what different IPs mean and what parts of the network they're on than trying to do everything in one IP and just kind of squish them all over each other sequentially, because a /8 for me is way more devices than I'd use in a home lab or even a medium-sized business typically. So I'm going to define it, set DNS servers on this system, and hit register. Now that I've finished installing my VM, it's time to put my storage on here. Because of how TrueNAS addresses drives, it needs a serial number, which turns out works best by using SATA storage on here. So I need to select SATA, select my large hard drive pool, put in 1 terabyte of storage space, discard so that I can remove data as needed, and then I'm going to click add so it's ready to be used on the TrueNAS system to store all my backups. Now that my TrueNAS system is set up with the correct password and IP address, it's ready to go. There is some extra configuration you might want to do on your system, like adding additional users or anything like that, but I find for just a basic single system backup where I'm the only administrator, this is a good place to start when it comes to setting that up. So now I'm going to go under create pool. I'm going to call this MacBook backup. I'm going to click next, and then I'm going to just do a stripe with my single virtual disk. It's not optimal, and it's going to complain that this isn't how you should set it up on here, but because this is already running on redundant storage in the VM, It's not a big issue that it's only a single drive in here. And I'm going to click create pool and confirm and continue. And in a few seconds, that pool should be ready to go. And then I'm going to go create a data set, which allows me to do some extra ZFS functionality at a data set level. I'm not going to use those features, but I find it nice to effectively create a folder for just this time machine use case instead of doing it on the root level in case I want to perhaps back up another Mac or use this for anything else. So I'm just going to hit save here and it's going to be created. And now that this is created, I can go under shares and under this, turn on the SMB sharing service. So now that Apple has effectively killed AFP shares, SMB shares is what Apple uses for Time Machine backups, even if you're using only Apple machines for this purpose. So when I go under SMB shares is the big reason why I'm using TrueNAS here instead of DIYing it. Time Machine shares, because it presents it to macOS as a Time Machine share, and as it shows here, it uses the Apple SMB2 protocol extensions, because Apple does a little bit of extra stuff instead of using just the base SMB storage as I discussed earlier, which makes it how Apple does it. So I've used this data set I've already created here, MacBook Pro backup. I'm going to hit save and configure this here. And it looks like it's enabled Time Machine and it needs to restart the service. And since nothing else is using that service, it's ready to go. Now I'm going to configure my share with the correct permissions so that I can access it on my Mac and no one else on the network can access it without my password. So I can either use my main login password, which typically isn't recommended because if you get access to that password, now I can access all of TrueNAS. I can make it a open network share so anyone on the network can access it. But since those data on here I like to keep private and personal, I don't want everyone on my network to be able to access my Time Machine backups with effectively all of my data. So I'm going to go under credentials, users, create a credential using my name as a user. So I'm just going to create my name here. SMB access is the only thing this user needs to have. I'm going to set up a password for this system. And there's a lot of additional details I can give it to make it work. Now, I do want to note there is some quirks when it comes to setting up Samba and permissions, because Samba has permissions as well as the data and the files folder underneath it, and both need to have access for it to work. So I'm going to go under shares, I'm going to go under show actions, edit share ACL, and I'm going to say everyone has access, so that means my new user now has access. And then I'm going to edit file system ACL, which is the actual file system underneath, which I also need access to be able to do it. Then once that's up, I'm going to say, hey, I want to set it to restricted, so that way only my user can access it. And now that I have it in here, I'm going to change the owner to my new user, change the group to my new user, apply owner and group, because only I need to access this share. And my plan is make a different share if I wanted to back up a different person's computer, for example. And I'm going to say save the access control list, and it's going to edit the permission so that way my user has read, write, execute permission on that share. So let's take a look at that permissions on my laptop now. One quick other setting I want to set on the system before actually using it is I'm going to change the host name, which is what it'll appear in macOS, to MacBook Backup VM. So instead of just seeing TrueNAS in the network, I'm going to see that. So I'm going to save those settings. So now it's going to appear as the correct name in all my systems and should be ready to go on my Mac. So let's take a look at my Mac and how that's all going to work on here. So taking a look on this system, I can see on my network, I have like my server, which is the blue screen thing, but I also see my MacBook backup on here. But what really matters is if I go into system settings on my Mac, I then go under Time Machine, under General, Time Machine, I can see some of my previous drives I've tried using. And now I'm going to add my MacBook Pro backup on the VM. So it's going to go ask for permissions and say, hey, do you actually want to connect to this server? I'm going to give it permissions to connect to it with. I am going to choose not to encrypt my backup in this case. If I don't have super critical data, if it gets released, sometimes I think it's best to not encrypt backups, so that just in case if something weird was to happen, I have to get my backups back and I can't get the password for whatever reason, it's easier to restore my data, but depends on exactly your security versus restoring process. So they've also added a disk usage limit, because by default, it will try to fill the disk with all of its backups. I'm going to say none just because I want it to use all my disk space, but I could also set a smaller value, and I can see it knows that it's a 1 terabyte drive, which is awesome. So I'm going to hit done here, and it looks like it's going to back up automatically in a minute, or I can just start the backup now. And because this is on a Proxmox VM, I can go into summary and I can take a look at the utilization of my VM as it starts to run the backup and move some network traffic around. So time to see how fast my first backup goes once it's completed. So it's been a few days since I set this up, and my system has generally been just backing up just fine anytime it's on my home Wi-Fi and connected. And I can see this is the one it does. Backups yesterday. If I want to do one right now, it'll start it off if I do it manually, or it'll automatically do it anytime it's plugged in at home and on, which is awesome. The next thing I was curious about is speed. And in general, I am just limited by my Wi-Fi speed, so this is a little bit older of a laptop, but I'm using the new Unify Wi-Fi 6 or AX ones, and I'm getting generally about 40 some megabytes per second here, looking at the data rate, so no problems at all speed-wise. And while the first backup did take a couple of hours to happen, and I just let it run one night overnight, all the subsequent backups are quite quick because I'm not making huge file changes on this laptop, and copying 10 gigabytes at 40 megabytes per second in the background isn't really an issue at all for me typically. Now, the one other thing I'm curious about is how well restoring backups go, because backups are only as useful as your ability to recover them. So I'm going to go reboot my system into recovery modes on the system and just see if it shows up at all as an option. Unfortunately, I don't really want to wipe this laptop right now, but if it shows up, it should be visible. And I'm also curious if I can just pull my files off on, let's say, a Windows system in case I want to try that. I'm now signed in on my MacBook now. I'm in recovery mode, which is built into these Macs and is a neat functionality. I wish all the Windows systems had some alternative to essentially download the OS from the network. But I can go under other server, do smb:// punch in the IP. I won't do a full restore because I don't want to wipe this Mac right now at this moment, but it does look like it. The text on the network without any extra utilities or anything like that. So that's great to see. The one other thing I like to have with backups is the ability to restore them using different software if something was to happen, or at least on a different computer using a separate copy of the software. So if for some reason my Mac died and I didn't have another Mac, I can still extract those files. So I was trying to run a little test to show that, hey, there's a different way to extract the files. So in case I have a different OS and my main computer died, I can still get the files. And everything I could find pointed me to using HFS Explorer on Windows. So I installed it, did it, wouldn't show up, so I copied it to my local drive. I have this BM1 sparse bundle, which should have the files. Gives me an error, and I think there's something wrong with HFS Explorer that unfortunately I don't have too much time to troubleshoot. I tried just opening a publicly available DMG for like Chrome. It also says it doesn't work. I copied it to my local disk. I tried a few other things. So the other thing I tried is I have a Mac directly behind me in this video, and in this case I can mount the network drive, open the sparse bundle, see all the backups, and I can just play like a video directly from the backups if I want to, or copy the files. So while I'd love to have availability for Time Machine on a non-Mac system, at least if I'm only working with Macs, I can restore it on a different system file by file. I can do a bootable restore on that same Mac as long as I can connect to Wi-Fi. So I'll say, from everything I've seen, generally this does a pretty good job. So while having the ability to mount it on a different OS just in case something weird happens and I want my files back would be awesome, Time Machine does a pretty good job restoring from Mac and is a pretty painless solution as long as I have my computer plugged in and on my network every once in a while to get those backups going. And I find that to be a lot more convenient than trying to remember where I put this drive, moving it around with me, plugging it in, and I'm always worried that if I drop these or give them too much shock, they might have issues, and I already have the storage for other reasons, so I find that is kind of my go-to method. Let me know in the comments below if this seems like a good solution for you. This, for me, seems like a good, painless way to get backups running on my Mac without having to fiddle with drives. So let me know in the comments below if this feels like a solution for your type of backup problems. Also, let me know if there's any other future videos you want me to work on in the comments below. Thanks for watching.